Right, entry 50. We are now into August 17th, 1964, and this, I believe, is the longest entry in the entire journal. It runs 6 pages, and it covers quite a bit of material as you're in the home stretch here. Tell us how this begins.
Well, it does cover a 2-week period of time. It was dictated on August 17th, so it basically covers the work in the first 2 weeks in August, and it begins with a conversation with Mr. Rankin that Norman and I had, which in rereading sounds a little precious on our part. What Rankin reported to us after meeting with the Chief Justice was that the Chief Justice wanted the Commission to consider various draft chapters of the report in the order in which they would appear in the final volume. In other words, he did not want members of the Commission to look at the conspiracy chapter or sections of the conspiracy chapter, which I guess was chapter 6, before they might have considered chapter 3 dealing with the shots from the depository. The Chief Justice apparently told Rankin that many of the commissioners had commented to him that it was difficult for them to figure out precisely where each chapter went, since they were receiving the draft chapters in helter-skelter order. Quote, I quote the entry. I quote from the entry: "Mr. Rankin and I did not agree. I'm sorry, Mr. Redlick and I did not agree with Mr. Rankin that this was a particularly difficult assignment for the commissioners, since they had an outline of the entire report and should be able to figure out where the particular chapter would eventually go. Mr. Redlick and I did not believe that our work schedule should be altered so as to accommodate this particular desire of the commissioners," end quote. Now,
I love your passive aggressiveness.
So expressing these views on paper to be heard only by my secretary didn't seem to me a threat of any kind, but it is interesting to reread in that light. And at the time, it was obvious that that I was working on a revised draft of Chapter 8 and then planned to turn to Chapter 6 on conspiracy, which was in what I say some rough first draft form, and Norman Redlick was working on either Chapter 5 dealing with Ruby, or on Chapter 4 dealing with the assassin. So it prompted a further conversation with Mr. Rankin, who later in the day seemed, although he had seemed persuaded by our rhetoric or complaint, but later in the day he proceeded to assign portions of the report to Mr. Goldberg and Mr. Marmore, and altered assignments to Mr. Goldberg. In other words, took the initiative by taking things away from us and putting them in the hands of other people, so that he would have revised copies of the forward Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 for the Friday meeting of the Commission. In other words, he readjusted what limited resources we had to accommodate the desire of the Chief Justice and the members of the Commission.
Tell us who Mr. Marmore is. Mr.
Marmore was someone that Al Goldberg knew from the State Department. He was also a historian. He was one of the older members of the staff. He'd been in a variety of government positions during his career, and he was asked from time to time to do a little bit of writing and do some editing. And I had some difficulty with his editing on matters, because I always felt that the members of the staff, were not fungible, and you had to be careful about who you asked to review whose work, because it could not be done really effectively unless they had some understanding of where the draft came from that's in front of them and what kind of footnoting was appropriate. So I had a modest dispute with Mr. Marmore on one occasion, but I think we had made up by this time.
That's a good point you bring up, though, because in the years since, Spector and Bellin, they've gone on television programs and they've discussed the assassination as a whole, everything from Oswald's background to Ruby's shooting of Oswald, and they come across as having helped to shape the entirety of the Commission's report, but really they worked on very specific areas, and it wasn't until later, I suppose, that they became experts in the entirety of it.
Well, to some extent that's true, but I think the point you make is a good one, because many of those people ended up commenting on chapters that they never had worked on, and in fact we're coming to a significant issue with respect to Jim Liebler, who decided at a very late date to comment in detail on chapters that he had never seen in draft form. Mm-hmm. But going back to the entry of August 17, it was clear that Mr. Rankin's reassignments were calculated to accommodate the Commission, and that made Norman Redlich particularly upset, among other reasons, because he did not feel that Chapter 4 was ready for the stylistic editing, and I quote, that he believed Goldberg could perform, and that Goldberg was not in a position to deal substantively with the issues of Chapter 4, which were the issues of outlining the evidentiary case with respect to Oswald as being the assassin. So Norman, as I say, was, quote, particularly upset, unquote, by Rankin's decision, and it prompted a meeting among the three of us with respect to Rankin's recent reallocation of responsibilities. Norman made it clear that what his views were, and argued that Chapters 3 and 4 should not be handled in this way, but rather they should wait until he and I were ready to give them the substantive editing that they required. And the entry goes on to say, although I did not feel as strongly about the matter as Mr. Redlich, I did tell Mr. Rankin that I thought this was a waste of our resources and that it was not essential that we meet these preferences of the Commission unless they directed us to do so. During the course of this discussion, Mr. Rankin made the unfortunate slip of tongue to the effect that if Mr. Redlich and I had our way, we would produce the report, quote, at our leisure, unquote. At this point, Mr. Redlich and I both became a little upset and suggested to Mr. Rankin that the work we were doing was not being done at our leisure. Mr. Rankin regretted the comment, and later that evening, after I had gone home, Mr. Redlich and Mr. Rankin went out to dinner, and Mr. Rankin went out of his way to apologize to Mr. Redlich and commented that he did not intend that Goldberg would rewrite the chapter, but only do stylistic editing of the material for Mr. Redlich's consideration, end quote. You know, what's interesting about reading this is that I constantly referred to people as Mr. this or Mr. that. Mm-hmm. One of my grandsons read portions of the book, or I think rather than the journal, and he, this a couple of years ago, and he is graduated recently from engineering program at Columbia. And he said, why did grandfather continually refer to people as Mr. or something? And my son, a lawyer, said, well, that's the way they used to do it in the olden days. And so, but it does sound so formal, but it came quite naturally. I guess I never thought of referring to everyone by their first name in the course.
Most of these people were older than you, right? So it was a sign of respect.
Well, that's certainly true, but everyone was referring to everyone as Mr. this or Mr. that. But in any event, I report that I had at least one grandson look at my historic record and comment not on substance but on style.
Before we move on to the next morning, it's hard to get a sense. You're very diplomatic in the way you write this, despite some passive aggressiveness from time to time. But were there moments where you were shouting or snapping at each other? It feels a little bit like, at this point, 12 angry men, you've been sequestered too long as this thing wraps up. But what was the tone like when you would talk to each other?
Well, it varied. I mean, there were among the three of us, there were a few tense moments. Going back to the second entry, where I challenged Lee Rankin with respect to the handling of witnesses who came before the commission. There were only 2 or 3 occasions, and certainly among the 3 of us, there was always a resolution promptly, and that reflected, in fact, the close personal relationship that Lee Rankin and Norman Redlich had, which had become closer. But as I mentioned earlier, they had known each other before the Warren Commission brought them together. So I think, though, we have referred earlier to some disputes within the staff, and particularly where Joe Ball was involved, and the revision of his work was the subject of a heated discussion, and there it did become personal, and I'm not as clued in as I might have been, but those matters typically got resolved. But it did leave some lingering feelings of disrespect and not being treated fairly on Joe's part, and I'm sure other members of the staff, to a much lesser degree, may have felt at some point their views were not being fairly heard. But for the most part, I mean, it was really an important part of my job was to hear those complaints and to try to mediate those disputes and to try to assure each member of the staff that their work was respected, because I was keenly aware of the cost if any member of the staff should become so distracted and antagonistic that he would consider either resigning out of protest or publicly disown the final product once it became published if it had not fairly been subject to his opportunities to comment on particular findings made by the commission or the way in which the findings were supported.
And to your credit, not a single staff member ever did a hit piece on the commission or anything like that. Certain researchers have taken memos and so forth out of context, but no one who actually participated in the creation of the report ever came forward and said that they disagreed fundamentally with the conclusions.
I think there have been some expressions of disappointment by 1 or 2 members of the staff in light of the continued disclosures of failures by the agencies to cooperate fully. And I think that some members of the staff have given interviews in which they express some disenchantment with the way the commission handled issues in their area. And that has been seized upon by a few authors to extend the critique more generally to the work of the commission. I think these expressions have developed in the last several years, and after all, we're talking about a period of over 50 years. And I think your assessment about unanimous support for several decades is exactly right, and it's an important part of the last chapter of my book, which deals with the aftermath of the commission report up to the year when I wrote it, which was 2013.
Yeah, I know we're going to be talking about that a little bit later. Let's go back here, page 2. You say the next morning, Redlich, Rankin, and I discussed the matter further and agreed that we would produce the foreword, chapters 1 and 2 for the commission, following which we would make an effort to turn out chapters 3 and 4 the following week. So you are going in chronological order for the most part to accommodate the
absolutely. After all, I think we realize the commission members deserve some deference, and so we did go forward to work on chapters so that they could be produced in that order.
Pick it up with on Friday, August 7th. That's at the bottom of page 2. Tell me a little bit about what's going on here, and then you also talk about the week of August 10th.
Right.
It's some of the same stuff, but it's worth noting that you were going through this process.
Well, at this point, actually, the chapter 1 was one that we had. It had three components that basically described the creation of the commission. Secondly, it dealt with the fact of the trip to Dallas, and then the third section was the critical one that we were not able to write until this point in our work, because it was intended to summarize the findings and conclusions and recommendations of the commission. So that required, obviously, that the substance of each chapter be at a position where each chapter contained findings and recommendations, if such were appropriate, and then based on those chapters, you would draft a section for Chapter 1 that summarized those conclusions. Right. And one would expect the summary of conclusions in Chapter 1 to reflect accurately the conclusions set forth in the relevant chapters. And there is at least one important respect where there was a deviation of some significance. So in any event, this shows that I was busy working at this point on the conclusions, and Redlick was dealing with a portion of the same chapter that was the narrative, and so together we were working to try to put together this Chapter 1 or forward, and then proceed to Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. So.
See here. Week of August 10th, I worked primarily on revisions of chapters 6 and 3.
Yes, and I say with respect to Chapter 6, it did present a significant problem because there was a good deal of material that had been generated. It was a chapter in which Jenner and Griffin collaborated because it was really a chapter. 6 had to deal with the personal histories of Oswald and Ruby, in order to some extent to deal with the potential for conspiracies. And Chapter 3, of course, dealt with the shots from the depository. But so there were some real problems here with respect to the drafts, and I had asked Stuart Pollock to help Bert Griffin in Area 5, and I think I've made the point elsewhere that I had eventually, by this time, I had reached the conclusion that Bert Griffin and Leon Hubert had been understaffed, and it reflected a failure in judgment by Rankin and me, in particular, to recognize that 2 lawyers were being asked to deal with issues involving Ruby's history, his entry into the basement, his shooting of Oswald, and all the aspects of his life that might have led to suggestions of conspiracy that had to be explored. So as I thought it through in discussions with them, I realized they were trying to do the work that we had 4 or 5 lawyers doing nearly full time with respect to Oswald. So it's at that point when I set sort of a deadline for them in terms of producing all their investigative requests. This must have been sometime, obviously it was before August, but it was back quite late in late June or July, most likely. And I asked for a deadline at which they would have all investigative requests, and they did present 40 or 50, which we reviewed. And so, but having extended the investigation so far into the summer, it was quite understandable that the chapter that was to be based on those investigative efforts, was late in being drafted and was probably pulled together more rapidly than Bert, who had the burden for this, could put together. So our entry into the picture to help with the editing and providing additional staff in the form of Stuart Pollock, who was extraordinarily capable, we were trying to bring the chapter up to the level at which it might be presented to the Commission.
Towards the bottom of this page, it looks like presidential protection is still an ongoing issue, and this is just a month before the report comes out.
Yeah, it did surprise me on rereading the journal about how this issue kept being discussed. That resulted in large part by the fact that Mr. Dulles felt very strongly about this. And he really did feel that protection of the president was an assignment that should be given the highest priority, and that's why he thought it should be the responsibility of the National Security Advisor in the White House. And his view was that the intelligence work domestically would be done by the FBI, the intelligence work in foreign areas would be done by the CIA, and the providing of personnel to be on the ground when the president visited either foreign countries or the United States would be provided by federal law enforcement people and local law enforcement people working together. That was his overall proposal. In retrospect, it has considerable merit in terms of highlighting the need for presidential protection, but it got only modest support in the commission from Congressman Ford, and ultimately, as we may have discussed, Secretary Dillon came in with modest improvements in procedures and a request for more funds to enable diversification of staff and so forth, and the commission resolved this matter by unanimously going along with Dillon's recommendations.
Dulles' recommendation does make sense because part of the failure here was the lack of communication between agencies. So if it's reorganized in such a way so that all the agencies have pieces of the pie, then ostensibly they would communicate with each other because they would have to in order to get the job done.
One would hope so. I mean, but as we've discussed earlier, as a result of 9/11, the Secret Service was located among many other agencies in the Department of Homeland Security.
And still an agency that's rife with scandal and criticism and controversy right up to the present day.
That seems to be the case.
All right, so moving along here to page 4 of this memo. Let's see. It looks like you're continuing to review. Do you want to talk a little bit about Mr. Marmore and the some of the changes he made to the footnotes?
Well, my problem with his footnoting was simply that he didn't understand, first of all, the concept of footnoting the way we were doing it, and so I thought it was just sort of a mistake to have asked him to do this. I mean, generally, as I say, his editing revisions were useful and improved appearance and readability of the chapter. However, it was clear that he had not considered any of the matters of substance that had to be considered in the chapter, such as the relevance of the material dealing with the missed shot. Actually, on that subject, I remember personally drafting the 3 paragraphs in the chapter that analyzed the question of whether that shot was the one that missed. Mm-hmm. So it looks rather simple-minded in reading today, because among other suggestions, I may have made the error of suggesting that the first shot was an easy one, or easier one, so as to perhaps minimize the probabilities that it would have been the missed shot. In fact, it was not an easy shot, and it more likely than not was the missed shot, as I think may be the case, even if we don't fully accept Max Holland's view of why it missed. Mm-hmm. But in any event, that's illustrative of why he would proceed dropping footnotes out without rhyme or reason, which was somewhat perturbing. In any event, it sounds like I was in sort of a not very charitable mood in reviewing what he was done. And of course, it was at a time where we really couldn't afford delays that were caused by miscommunication in dealing with the drafts, and a matter of that kind, if he had serious problems, he should have come to me or the staff member most acquainted with the material discussed, and explained his dissatisfaction with either the style or the annotation by footnote.
And while we're on the footnotes, this appeared, I think, in an entry or 2 back, but the decision made to where to put the footnotes, to put them at the bottom of the page. Do you have any comments on that?
No, I remember a debate about whether footnotes should be at the bottom or I guess at the end. Mm-hmm. They end up where do they end up?
I believe
At the bottom?
I think they might be. Footnotes would be at the bottom. Endnotes would typically be at the end of the chapter.
Yeah, well, all I remember feeling was that spending time with Goldberg discussing this issue, I would put the footnotes wherever Goldberg wanted them to be put, and I'm sure that's what was done.
Can you look back at the final report today and pick out the bits you wrote? Can you?
Only very few, and I just remember looking at that and taking that assignment on, and I'm sure what I wrote was edited by Norman or others, but I remember looking at the three shots in that way.
On Friday, August 14th, the commission met in the morning. Several of them had read the conspiracy chapter and suggested that considerably more work had to be done on the chapter. What were their concerns with that?
Well, I don't really remember exactly what their concerns were, whether it was to the lack of dealing with some allegations, or whether it was simply a matter of style. There were, of course, in the conspiracy area, ongoing issues throughout this period, for example, the whole question of Mr. Nosenko, the defector, was still unresolved, and it may be that, and there were allegations that were still the subject of debate at the state level, at the staff level, including Sylvia Odio and her story. So it may well be that the members of the commission had hoped to see in the chapter on conspiracy some more conclusive resolution of issues of that kind. As to Nosenko, they realized that they could not rely on Nosenko's assessment of Oswald's status in the Soviet Union and the fact that he was not a Soviet agent in any regard, because the CIA would not vouch for his integrity or reliability. And as I've mentioned before, that dispute went on within the agency for several years. So the commission had some problem with how to deal with the fact that they knew about Nosenko, but they were unable to rely on it. And I think basically they had a letter or official request from the CIA basically not to comment on this subject.
I think we've covered pretty much everything from this entry. You might glance at page 6 and see if there's anything else on that last page you want to talk about. You do mention having a feeling of complete discouragement because you had been looking forward to the termination of this work.
Yeah, well, I would just go back to the meeting on Friday the 14th, because it was here that there was a commission discussion about timetable, and Senator Russell in particular argued that he could not spend sufficient time on the materials to see that they got to the president in page-proof form by September 1. The materials were not going to the president on any schedule, so I don't quite understand why he thought the page-proofs were going, but he was emphasizing, and I quote, he spoke of his various responsibilities as a senator during the past 8 months, particularly his work on the appropriation bills, and said that this was why he urged the president not to appoint a senator, or in fact the Chief Justice, to the commission. Many of the other members of the commission apparently agreed with him, end quote. I mean, it's a matter of public record that Senator Russell attended very few meetings of the commission, and that he had spent several weeks during the summer leading the opposition to the Civil Rights Act, which was pending before the Senate, and which was ultimately adopted.
Which caused a major falling out between Russell and the president at the same time.
Yes, that certainly was the case. And so it's unclear to me whether at this point he was seeking an extension of time. I think that may have come up a little bit later, but it was quite clear from his comments at this session that the Chief Justice, and therefore Rankin and the staff, had a serious problem in getting the work done in a way that would meet his needs and those of the other members of the commission.
So ultimately you request 2 additional weeks. from the White House, and that's when you say that you were disheartened because you had been hoping it was going to end.
Yes, I say, upon hearing this, my simultaneous reaction was an outburst of crying, or trying to burst out in any event. So, but it was needed and necessary, and you had to accommodate members of the commission. And the fact is, we needed the time ourselves as staff to do and continue with the critical process of ensuring that the report properly analyzed all the available evidence, and that the conclusions were stated clearly and as the commission wanted. So, as I say, I think that Norman and I overreacted, and that we got over that shortly and went on to discuss Chapter 4, which apparently